encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Inside the Scholar's Study, where we discuss all things concerning Scripture, faith, and scholarship. My name is Brad McNutt. If you're ready, we're going to go inside the Scholar's Study, and we're going to continue our discussion today. I think last week we introduced Jerome's prefaces to the books that he was translating, and gave some information about him. And so now this week, where are we turning?
I think I'll just start off with his preface to the Pentateuch. And, you know, if you were, I guess, opening a Latin Bible, this would be the first of the prefaces you would read. And it will introduce us to at least some of the issues or some of the things he likes to talk about in these prefaces. This would be the first preface you read, but it's not the first preface he wrote. In fact, this was in fact one of the last that he wrote. He did not translate the Bible in order. And just to remind listeners what we're talking about. So this is Jerome. This is, the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century. And this is the guy that translated the Latin Vulgate. So he's translating from Hebrew for the Old Testament. He's translating from Hebrew into Latin. And that was a controversial thing to do at that time because the traditional Latin Bible was a translation from the Septuagint, and the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that goes back to before the time of Jesus. And the Greek-speaking Christians often thought of the Septuagint as inspired as a translation. The actual Greek translation was inspired, and Latin speakers tended to think that same thing. So the Latin speakers had a Latin translation of the Septuagint, and they thought of that Septuagint as inspired. They didn't think of their Latin translation of the Septuagint as inspired, but if you're going to improve the Latin translation, it should be in reference to the Septuagint. But Jerome didn't do that. He went back to the original Hebrew. And so that was a controversial thing to do. Somewhat.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do we know what manuscripts Erasmus used to translate from for the Old Testament?
Jerome. Is that who we're talking?
Yes, Jerome. I'm sorry. I may have said something else.
You said Erasmus.
Sorry. Yeah. Jerome. Do we know which manuscripts he used?
What manuscripts to translate from the Old Testament? No, in fact, we don't have any so we're talking about Hebrew manuscripts, of course. We don't have any Hebrew manuscripts from that time period. We have Jerome comes right in the middle of this big gap that we have in our attestation for the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. We've got the Dead Sea Scrolls from around the time of Jesus, and then, several hundred years after Jerome, we've got these Masoretic manuscripts, but they're in the, for the most part, during the entire 1,000-year period, the first 1,000 years of church history. We just don't have any Hebrew manuscripts from that time period. They've all been, lost or destroyed or something. Now, what we can tell, though, just from looking at Jerome's translation, the Latin Vulgate, very often, almost always, attests a Hebrew text that is basically the same as the Masoretic text would be, several hundred years later. Yeah. Okay, so let me just, he started translating from the Hebrew Bible in about the year 390, maybe 391 AD, and he finished it all up in about 405. The very last thing he translated was Joshua Judges Ruth, all three of those together, and there's a preface for those. So the preface to the Pentateuch is the second to last thing that he translated for the Old Testament. So it's about the year 400 or so. I mean, we don't know exactly when it was, but about the year 400 is when he wrote the preface. By the way, one interesting, weird sort of, I don't know, thing about the way Jerome does this is that he writes the preface first, and then he translates the book. So I think he wrote the preface in like 400, and then he did the translation, and so he didn't actually, I think, publish the translation for a few years because he was working on the actual translation. Okay, so here is the very beginning. This is in my translation of Jerome's preface to the Pentateuch, written about the year 400.
Coming to a
He's
bookstore near you at some
yes,
point.
in a couple of years,
Yeah.
probably. Yeah. I have received much desired letters from my Desiderius. Now that's a guy's name, Desiderius.
Mm.
Let me just read this sentence. It's a long, complicated sentence. Then we'll come back and talk about it. So he says, I have received much desired letters from my Desiderius, who by some presage of future events was allotted a name with Daniel, requesting that I deliver for the ears of our people a translation of the Pentateuch into the Latin language from Hebrew speech. Certainly a dangerous task, open to the barking of the detractors who assert that, as an insult to the 70 translators, I am forging something new in place of the old. Okay, so that's the end of the sentence. All right. Somebody named Desiderius has requested a translation of the Pentateuch. Now, would Jerome have translated the Pentateuch whether or not Desiderius Yes, absolutely. I mean, he's involved in this entire translation project. And probably multiple people, I would imagine, multiple people have been requesting a translation of various books of the Bible. It's just that now's the time that he's turning his attention to the Pentateuch, and he chooses out this one particular guy who has made this request, Desiderius, and so this is the dedication of the work. You know, in modern books, often we'll have a dedication to them. This is what that is. I think we talked last week about what the point of such a thing was, that normally the person named in the dedication would be somewhat responsible for advertising this new work, making sure it got copied and circulated in that world. So that's Desiderius. Now, we don't know anything about Desiderius. He is named a couple other times, but we basically don't know anything about him. So, you know, a lot of times we will know, you know, it'll be a famous person that he dedicates the work to, but not in this instance.
He's named. I'm sorry. He's named a couple more times in Jerome or outside of this.
Jerome dedicates another letter to him, and there are some, I don't have it right in front of me, but there are some other works not by Jerome that also name him, maybe are dedicated to him. So, line here, I have received much desired letters from my Desiderius. Well, Desiderius, the name means desired. So Jerome is doing a little play there. And in fact, the Latin is basically the same, where I have received much desired letters, Desiderius letters from Desiderius. And then Jerome says, by some presage of future events was allotted a name with Daniel. And so he is referring to the Daniel of the Bible, the book of Daniel, and in Latin, the character Daniel in the book of Daniel is called Desiderius a few times. I can give you the references. That what I mean is he is called desired, like man of desires or something like this. in the Latin text. So it's Daniel 9 verse 23. I think that would probably be like Gabriel talking to Daniel, and then Daniel chapter 10 verse 11 and verse 19. All of those passages in the Latin translation use the term Desiderius in reference to Daniel. And, I think sometimes it's translated beloved or something like this. But so Jerome comparing Desiderius to Daniel. And then he says that this guy, Desiderius, he has requested that I deliver for the ears of our people, that's Latin speakers, a translation of the Pentateuch into the Latin language from Hebrew speech. All right, I think all of that is relatively clear. And then Jerome says this is certainly a dangerous task, open to the barking of detractors who assert that as an insult to the 70 translators, the 70 translators are, of course, the translators of the Septuagint. That's how it got its name. Septuagint is because Septuagint in Latin means 70. And so it's the traditional Greek translation of the Old Testament is called the Septuagint because it's the translation of the 70, the translation of the 70 translators. So Jerome says that I know when I do this, when I issue a translation of the Pentateuch in Latin from the Hebrew, people are going to say that I'm trying to insult the 70 translators, meaning like that he's trying to say their work is no good or something like this, which, I mean, there's some truth in that accusation. I mean, even though Jerome defends himself like all over the place, Jerome is defending himself. I'm not trying to insult the 70 translators, but then also he criticizes the Septuagint and the 70 translators, not infrequently as well. So, it's a well-known thing about Jerome that he sort of speaks out of both sides of his mouth, or like he determines how I guess everybody does this to some extent, determines how he is representing himself and his motivations depending on who he's talking to, sort of like a good politician. And then, so at the end of that, I am for that. It's these detractors are going to say that only as an insult to the 70 translators, I am forging something new in place of the old. So I think what he's getting at there, and this also goes to like how is he representing his work, that some and sometimes he does represent his work as a replacement, that he wants to he he wants church people, he wants Christians to use in Latin, to use his translation rather than a translation of the Septuagint. But there are other times that he doesn't represent his work in that way. That he says, my translation of the Hebrew can simply be a point of comparison. You can use it sort of like a study method. If you're interested in what the Hebrew says, you'll need to get mine, but you're of course welcome to continue to use your traditional Latin translation of the Septuagint for most purposes. And, we're familiar with that as well, just because, in the English speaking world, there are so many translations. And, usually I would think a translation these days in English is not going to be published under the assumption that we have now produced the definitive English translation that will supersede and displace all other English translations of the Bible. That's not going to happen. But it's another point of comparison for people. And Jerome is saying that his own translation can be that. And I think he probably had these multiple goals for his Latin translation, that the most lofty goal is that it could displace the old Latin translation, the Latin translation of the Septuagint. But even if not displace, a secondary goal, at least be a point of comparison, that people could value it for that reason. So the next sentence, they give they, that is these detractors, they give their approval to talent as to wine. And I think what he means there is that, the old is better. So yeah, like the 70 translators are necessarily better than Jerome because they're older than Jerome. Whereas I myself often attest that, according to my ability, I am offering to the tabernacle of God what I can. All right, there he's drawing on, what is it, Exodus 29 or something, where they're collecting gifts for the tabernacle, for this newly created tabernacle or planned tabernacle, and Moses and others are collecting presents for that, and then people give what they can. That's what Jerome is doing. And then he says, and one person's wealth is not defiled by the poverty of others. So his own, let's see, Jerome, let me just read the footnote I've written here. Jerome considers it harmless for the Septuagint and his own version to coexist within the churches, an idea which he frequently mentions. And then I've got some citations here. It is not clear whether Jerome describes his own translation here as the wealthy one or the poor one, although it's probable that he describes it as the wealthy one, and the 70 are the poor ones. No, I mean, he does, the wealthy one is in the singular and the poor ones is in the plural, so it would seem that the poor ones must be the 70. All right, so that's how he opens. And then here we're going to get into a little bit more complicated material in this next little bit. He says, I dare to do this work because I am provoked, on the one hand, by the industriousness of Origen. Well, I do feel it almost necessary here to just make this a little easier to follow, because this is another really long sentence. So let me just get to the two halves of the sentence. So he says, the reason he's doing this is that he's provoked, on the one hand, by the industriousness of Origen. Origen is a person's name, and we'll come back and talk about him. I'm sure we've mentioned him a time or two on this podcast. And then he describes what he means by that. And then Jerome says, and on the other hand, by the authority of the evangelists and apostles. And then he talks about that a little bit. And, just as I'm noticing this, boy, this is a really long sentence. I think it's like the entire paragraph is just one sentence. So let's go ahead and talk about the two halves there. So on the one hand, what's motivating him is Origen, and on the other hand, it's the apostles. So Origen first. Origen was a Greek-speaking Christian writer who died in about 254 AD, and so he died about 100 years before Jerome was born. But he was, let me think about this for a second. I guess he was probably the most famous Christian writer of, after the apostles. Origen when Jerome was growing up and learning to study the Bible, probably Origen's name was the most illustrious, famous name of a Christian writer after the time of the apostles. I think that's probably true. So everyone knew Origen's name. He was he was a scholar, and he worked on the text of the Greek Bible. Origen did. Now, maybe did we mention this last week? I feel like I have this vague memory of saying, no, we talked about Philo, and I said how, didn't we? I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, Origen worked on the text of the Greek Bible, and remember, the Greek Bible, for most purposes, that's the Septuagint. But Origen recognized that the Septuagint did not always agree with the Hebrew Bible, that sometimes they just said different things. Let's think of some examples. I'm going to try to think of some examples off the top of my head. So, for instance, in Genesis, one example is in, I think this is right, in Genesis 2, at the beginning of, this is the creation account. And remember, it says, God rested on the seventh day. What verse is that? Like Genesis 2, verse 3, probably. Or maybe it's verse 4. That's when we think of that as like God rested on the seventh day. That's the traditional Hebrew text that we've got. The Septuagint actually says God rested on the sixth day. So that's a little difference. Now, I mean, which one is right and which one is wrong? I think the traditional Hebrew text in that instance is right, but it's a difference. And Origen recognized, okay, here's a difference between the traditional Septuagint and the traditional Hebrew text don't say quite the same thing. You go to a few chapters later, there's another famous difference. I think this is Genesis 4:8. I want to look to make sure I'm getting it right. I'm reading the King James here, which is the King James is a translation of the Hebrew text. And it says, and Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. Okay, but it doesn't tell us what Cain said to Abel, so that's a famous lack in the Hebrew text. The King James is representing pretty closely the Hebrew text there, that it says Cain talked with Abel, but it doesn't actually say what Cain said to Abel. But even if you're just reading the King James, what could Cain have said to Abel other than something like, let's go to the field? Because it says when they were in the field, like the very next thing is they were in the field and Cain rose up and killed him. Well, that's an accurate reflection of the Hebrew text, but the Septuagint actually has the speech that Cain gave to Abel. So the Septuagint says, and Cain said to his brother Abel, let us go into the field. Let us go into the field. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up and slew him. So there's another little difference. And Origen noticed these things on that particular one, by the way. I mean, is the Septuagint better than the Hebrew text in that particular verse? I don't know. Probably. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm hesitating a little bit on that because of what I've already said, that even if you're just reading the King James as an accurate translation of the Hebrew text, what else could he have said other than like, let's go into the field? That's an obvious way to interpret it, whether or not you've got access to some original text. Which means that maybe that's what the 70 translators did. Maybe they had a Hebrew text in front of them that also lacked the speech of Cain to his brother Abel, but they just filled it in with the most obvious way of filling it in. I think that's possible, but I do think the Hebrew text is lacking something that used to be there, which is the speech. And the speech is in the Septuagint. So whether or not it preserves the original reading, it must preserve something like the original reading. And it does show that the Hebrew text is, I think, faulty in that verse. What do you think? Does that make sense enough, Brad?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Origen noticed these things. The main point is the Septuagint oftentimes has these differences with the traditional Hebrew text. What are you going to do with that? So this is what Origen did. As a first step, first of all, he was really smart, really hard worker. Jerome says that it's the industriousness of Origen that has motivated him to do his own work. Origen is a really hard worker, and he wants to do the due diligence in studying these different texts. So, what he does is he gets the Hebrew text and he gets the Septuagint, and he puts them side by side. All right, but the problem is he can't read Hebrew, so he doesn't just need the Hebrew text; he needs a transliteration of the Hebrew. Into Greek, of course. Origen is a Greek speaker, so it's a transliteration of the Hebrew text into Greek. Transliteration is like where you're representing the Hebrew words in Greek with Greek letters, with the Greek alphabet. We do this all the time. So, like, I mean, basically, like in hallelujah is a transliteration of a Hebrew word, or amen is just straight out of the Hebrew. We're just representing it with our alphabet. So that's what Origen does. So he needs the Hebrew text, but then he also needs the transliteration of the Hebrew text so that he can at least pronounce the words. And then he's got the Septuagint. But and just by that he can see where the Septuagint has more stuff than the Hebrew or less stuff. You know, if he just sets them side by side, even if he can't read Hebrew, he can at least see where one text has more text than the other. And so, okay, he does that. But he would also like to know where do they have the same amount of text? They just say different things. So that would be like that Genesis, I think it's Genesis 2:2, isn't it? Where God rested on the seventh day in the Hebrew, but it's the sixth day in the Greek. If he wouldn't be able to tell that without being able to read Hebrew, he wouldn't be able to tell that just by sitting them side by side. So he needs an ability to understand what does the Hebrew text actually say. Well, fortunately for Origen, there are other Greek translations of the Hebrew text that are available in his day, and he goes hunting for them, and he finds 3 of these other translations. So, yes, the Septuagint, which is the traditional one, but then there are 3 others. There's like, if we're going to put it in English Bible terms, there's like the KJV, but then he also finds the NIV, the ESV, and the NRSV, and he sticks them all there. And so that in his own terms, these translations are called Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. And he arranges them all. And Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion are well known as being closer to the Hebrew text than the Septuagint. And so they will help him see not only where does one have more stuff than the other, but also where do they have the same amount of stuff? It's just a different reading. It's a different word. And so he arranges all of these. So it's a 6-column Bible, and it's called the Hexapla. So we've got, here are the 6 columns. We've got the Hebrew text. We've got the transliteration of the Hebrew text. We've got Aquila, Symmachus, then the Septuagint, and then Theodotion. It's arranged in that way, columns 1 through 6. And, so he does this reportedly for the entire Hebrew Bible, so it would just be an enormous work. It would be, it's been estimated that it might have been up to 40 volumes for the Hexapla. And what's the point of the thing? Again, it's to be able to see clearly what are the differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text.
So is he copying all of these things into the 6 columns, or because it would be a massive financial undertaking too?
Yeah. Origen had this patron, I think his name was Ambrose, who had he was Mr. Moneybags, and yes, he paid for it all. Did Origen do any of the actual, copying himself? I'm not sure, but he did employ. We have records of this, or comments about this from antiquity, that he employed scribes, secretaries, to copy his works. And so at least they were involved in copying these all out in columns. So we have the hexapla, and that allows for easy comparison. Now, probably after that, what I'm about to say is a little bit controversial among scholars who care about such things, but I want to give you a possible way of understanding Origen's work here. I think he first compiled the hexapla as a tool, not as something that he would like publish and everybody would want their own copy of the hexapla. No, nobody wanted a copy of the hexapla. That was something for him. And from that, he could do the comparisons that would facilitate his work. And what he eventually came up with was his own edition of the Septuagint. And so it's called the Origenian or Origenian edition of the Septuagint, or sometimes it's called the hexaplaric edition of the Septuagint from the hexapla. So I think what he did was he took that Septuagint column, the fifth column of the hexapla, the Septuagint column, and he added into it where the Hebrew text, where he could tell from the Septuagint, where the Hebrew text had more stuff than the Septuagint. Then he copied out the Septuagint and added into it from one of those other translations so that it would match in length the Hebrew text. Which other translation? We know, well, according to these ancient testimonies, Theodotion. That was the translation in the sixth column. So Theodotion's translation had the material. When the Septuagint lacked it, the Hebrew had the material and the Septuagint lacked it. Theodotion had that material, and Origen copied it out of Theodotion and put it in the Septuagint. And then he would add a critical sign. He would add a little star or an asterisk by every line. So, think about your Bible, and, oftentimes it's in multi columns, two columns usually. And think of it like every line, you'll put an asterisk by the material that you're wanting to highlight. That's what Origen did. He copied it out of Theodotion, he put it in the Septuagint, and then by every single line, he put an asterisk. And the asterisk signaled, this is not material that I got from the Septuagint. This is material I got from Theodotion, and it's supposed to match the Hebrew text. Okay, but what about the opposite? What about the material where the Septuagint has more stuff in it than the Hebrew text? Well, then he put another critical sign, not an asterisk, but something called an obolus. And an obolus is, what does it look like? It basically just looks like a dash. Sometimes if you put, you can put dots around it so that it looks like a division symbol. And so the material that was in the Septuagint, but not in the Hebrew text, he would put that obolus by every line. All right, and this was the signal that there's more stuff in the Septuagint. Now, besides that, Origen did some other things. In his edition of the Septuagint, he did some other things. Okay, one of the things he did was he rearranged the word order. He rearranged the word order of the Greek so that it would match the Hebrew. Okay, and secondly, he changed the spelling of proper names so that it would match the Hebrew better. Okay, so he does quite a bit of intervention into the text of the Septuagint. What you end up with is this sort of supersized Septuagint because it has the material that the Hebrew lacked with obolus next to it, and it has the material that the Septuagint lacked with asterisk next to it. So it's sort of like this expanded version of the Septuagint. But the upshot of all of that work was to make the Septuagint more like the Hebrew text, to push the Septuagint closer to the Hebrew text. The Origenian recension of the Septuagint is a recension that is closer to the Hebrew text than the traditional Septuagint is. Okay, so Jerome says, I decided to translate directly from the Hebrew Bible because I received encouragement or motivation or provocation from the example of Origen, from the industriousness of Origen. So now let me read what he says about Origen, who mixed the translation of Theodotion with the ancient edition. Okay, I think we understand what he's getting at there. Marking up the entire work with the asterisk and obelus, that is, a star, asterisk, and a spear, the obelus, in order to illuminate what was previously missing or to murder and stab everything superfluous. All right, so Jerome is interpreting now. He's interpreting the specifically the obelus. He says, the obelus. I said the obelus looks like a dash. Well, Jerome says it looks like a spear. Okay, looks like a spear. I can see that, a dash and a spear. Is that seems like a violent sort of interpretation of the obelus. We're going to compare it to a military weapon. Okay, but fine. Yes, it has a similar appearance to a spear. And then Jerome says, now the reason he put that spear-like thing next to the passages that were extra in the Septuagint is because he intended to murder and stab those passages. Well, Origen does not say that. Origen does not say that he's intending to get rid of them or that he is wanting to, murder those passages. But that's how Jerome interprets it. And the point there is that the passages that are in the Septuagint and not in the Hebrew text, if Origen is wanting to murder those passages, what Jerome is saying is Origen just wants to get rid of them because he wants the Septuagint to match more the Hebrew. Well, that corresponds precisely to what Jerome wants to do. Jerome wants to translate directly from the Hebrew text, just get rid of all the stuff that is different in the Septuagint and get rid of all that and just match the Hebrew text. And so Jerome is interpreting Origen as close to his own motivations as he can. Let me just say, Origen himself did not say that he wanted to get rid of those passages. He just marked them so that you could see what was different and you could, I guess, make your own decision about what you wanted to do with that. Well, Jerome is attributing to Origen this motivation that he himself has to get rid of the passages. All right, so we've got the critical signs, and it's the reason Jerome says the reason I'm doing this is because of Origen, and then Jerome also says I'm also doing this because of the apostles. Let me read what Jerome says here. Among whom we read many things not contained in our codices. Meaning that when the apostles quote the Old Testament, they quote it in such a way that we can't find it in our own Bibles. And then he gives examples, such as, out of Egypt I have called my son. Now that's Matthew 2:15. Of course, Jerome did not cite the passage in that way. Chapter numbers came much later, but he just said, out of Egypt I've called my son. But I'll tell you where that comes from in our Bible. So Matthew 2:15. And because he will be called a Nazarene, that's Matthew 2:23. and they will look on whom they have pierced. That's John 19:37. And rivers of living water will flow from his belly. That's John 7:38. And what eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, and has not entered the heart of man, what things God has prepared for those who love him. That's 1 Corinthians 2:9. And then Jerome says, and many other things that require their own book. All right, so again, the point Jerome is trying to make is that the apostles quote the Old Testament, and they do not, oftentimes, Jerome says, those quotations do not match anything that we have in our traditional Bible. That is to say, the Septuagint. Those quotations don't match the Septuagint. Well, in doing this, Jerome is turning on its head a traditional Christian argument in favor of the Septuagint, because usually Christians would say the reason we Christians need to use the Septuagint for our Old Testament is primarily because the apostles used it. The apostles quoted the Septuagint. And Jerome is saying, no, they didn't. Here are 5 quotations which you cannot find in the Septuagint. It doesn't line up with the Septuagint, and I could supply many more. It would require its own work. And in fact, Jerome has already written this work about 5 or 6 years before writing this preface. Jerome had written a letter called Epistle or Letter 57, in which he discusses at length these sorts of issues, and lists, I think, 12. Here in the preface to the Pentateuch, he lists 5 quotations in the New Testament that don't line up with the Septuagint. I think in Epistle 57, he had listed 12 that don't line up with the Septuagint, he said.
What's interesting is some of those texts that were mentioned don't really line up with any trend. I mean, they look like it might be like a general gloss of saying, well, the Bible says, something like this.
Right.
Like 1 Corinthians 2:9 and John 7:38, Matthew 2:23, several of those. You're going to have a hard time nailing down a text.
Yeah, it's sort of like, if somebody in the modern period, as you were pointing out, somebody's here says, the Bible says God helps those who help themselves. Like, well, I mean, that's not a quotation. Is there implication of that? I mean, sometimes maybe in Proverbs, especially, or something, you could get that sort of point, but that might be an accurate summary of some parts of the Bible, but it's certainly not a quotation from the Bible. And so John 7:38, rivers of living water will flow from his belly. It seems to me that the best way of understanding that is exactly along those lines, certainly not as a quotation from any part of the Bible, but as perhaps a summary of teaching that is in the Bible. Something, or he shall be called a Nazarene. Again, definitely not a quote from the Bible, or I should say, I think very strongly not a quote, but an accurate summary of teaching in the Bible. I think that's probably the best way to understand that one. Some people want to relate it to Samson's birth in Judges 13, I think verse 15. He shall be called a Nazarite. And then some people want to relate it to the Hebrew word netzer in Isaiah 11, which means branch. And Jerome himself makes that relation with the netzer in Isaiah 11. I don't think that quite does it for me, but yeah, go ahead.
No, and it says it's written in the prophets, plural. He'll be called a Nazarene.
Yeah,
it's not just one, and so that's more of a generalized approach than let me point to a specific prophecy.
Yeah. In Matthew 2:23, it says prophets. It is right. I mean, just to leave Jerome for a second and go to that, it is interesting that when Matthew is quoting, Matthew, the narrator, is quoting the Old Testament to ground his story, that he always, except for once, talks about the prophet. But the one time, Matthew 2:23, he talks about the prophets as if he is signaling to us, just as you were pointing out, Brad, as if he's signaling to us that this is not a direct quotation from any one location, but is sort of a summary of prophetic teaching on the origins of the Messiah, something like this. Which, yeah, I mean, that's where I lean in for that particular one.
I'm pretty
He shall
sure
be
we
called
did
a
an
Nazarene.
episode on this in like season 2. I think we did New Testament
Okay,
using
yeah.
the Old Testament. So if people want to hear more about it, it's somewhere in there in season 2.
The one that I think really hits for Jerome here is "Out of Egypt I've called my son." The very first one he mentions, this quotation in Matthew 2:15. Matthew is quoting Hosea 11:1, and indeed it is the case that Matthew's quotation matches the Hebrew text better than the Septuagint. The Septuagint says something along the lines of, "Out of Egypt I called my children," or "he called his children." I forget exactly, but it's plural children. Look, is that a good translation of the Hebrew text? It's fine, depending on what purpose you're translating it. Let's think about that for just a minute. And I think we had a episode on this one as well back in a few seasons ago. In Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." Certainly Hosea is thinking about the children of Israel. That's the son. It's the nation that is the son. And so is it okay to translate that as plural sons, since you're talking about like plural people with, okay, I mean, I see it. Yeah, sure. I called my sons. Okay. But for Matthew's purposes, if you're trying to relate it to the Messiah, it just doesn't work as well. I mean, it's just not going to make any sense if you quote that verse as "Out of Egypt I called my sons." So it works much better if you just quote the Hebrew text more directly. So that's what we have in Matthew 2:15. And so I think Jerome is right to point out this is a quotation that does not match the Septuagint. In fact, it wouldn't make any sense if he quoted the Septuagint, but it matches the Hebrew text. And so you should not say that the apostles quote the Septuagint and just leave it at that. It does get a little more complicated than that. Now, Jerome certainly pushes that argument too far a lot of times when he says, like, the apostles never quote the Septuagint. They only ever quote the Hebrew text, which is nonsense. And Jerome, I think, knew it was nonsense, but he was pushing the argument as far as it would go, I think, to try to make some headway on it. But, okay, as we were just saying, it's really that first quotation, "Out of Egypt I've called my son," that matches the Hebrew text more. The rest don't do it quite as well. Now he has his verses where he thinks that they come from. So he goes on to say, let me just read the next little bit. "So let us ask them," that is the detractors, "where these things are written, and when they are not able to say, let us produce them from the Hebrew books. The first one is a testimony in Hosea, as we've just talked about, Hosea 11:1. The second is in Isaiah. That's the "he shall be called a Nazarene," Isaiah 11, as we've already said. The third in Zechariah. That's "they will look on whom they pierced." So that's Zechariah. Let's see. I don't have the exact reference. Do you know that one? What is that? 12 something?
Sounds like 12.
Yeah.
Maybe 13:1, or is that the fountain
Okay.
open for uncleanness?
Yeah.
Let me.
Yeah. Let's see. He says I'm surprised I don't have that written down. He says the fourth is Proverbs, And that's, let's see, the fourth is the rivers of living water will flow from his belly. Did you find the Zechariah one?
I haven't yet.
Oh, okay. Rivers of living water will flow from his belly. He says that comes from Proverbs. Um, Now, what in the world does he mean? Some people suggest Proverbs 18, verse 4. Um, let's see. Others suggest Proverbs 5, verse 16. There's nothing in Proverbs that actually says what John 7:38 says. So it's not exactly clear to me what Jerome is thinking there. But even it still illustrates the problem we've already said. Does that match the Hebrew more than it matches the Greek? I mean, that just doesn't seem like a very good argument. But Jerome makes the argument. I report.
Zechariah 12:10.
Thank you for the they will look on whom they have pierced. And then the last one, he says the last one is Isaiah. What eye has seen, what eye has not seen, ear has not heard, that one. And he, of course, we don't know exactly where in Isaiah Jerome is thinking, except that, well, we do, because he has a commentary on Isaiah, which he makes the identification. So it's Isaiah 64, verse 4 is what he means. Look, Jerome is right to point out that these were recognized as problem passages in the ancient church, like that Isaiah, the one I just did, 1 Corinthians 2:9, was recognized as a problem passage. And I think Athanasius tried to relate it to somewhere in Isaiah 29. I forget the exact verse, but I mean, he didn't. I think if you look at Isaiah 64, verse 4, and compare it to 1 Corinthians 2:9, you will say, yeah, there's a strong similarity there. It's not an exact quotation, but I see how there's definitely a relationship. But having said, and Jerome makes that identification as well, and I think he's right to make that identification. And he's also right to point out that a lot of people who studied 1 Corinthians 2:9 and tried to figure out where that quotation came from just came up with nothing. They didn't know where it came from. Athanasius tried to relate it to Isaiah 29. There were some people that said, well, maybe it comes from an apocryphal book. Maybe it was a book that Paul had access to that we just don't have anymore. So, I mean, Jerome is making, in some ways, a pretty good argument. He's recognizing some problem passages. Let me see. Even the one out of Egypt I've called my son, that was also recognized as a problem passage, even though I think people today don't think of it as a problem passage at all, because it lines up exactly with Hosea 11:1 if you're reading the Hebrew text. But if you're reading the Septuagint, it just doesn't. And so people had difficulty with that quotation. Where does it come from? And Jerome points out, well, it comes from Hosea. So, we'll wrap things up there. But Jerome, so just to summarize this section of Jerome's argument, what is it that has motivated me to issue this translation, just like all the other translations, not the Pentateuch specifically, but all the translations from the Hebrew Bible? It's because Origen already did this, and people love Origen. Origen already did this, and everybody's using the Bible he created. Well, I'm just doing the logical next step, not correcting the Septuagint toward the Hebrew, but just going back to the Hebrew. That's what I'm doing. And then also, the apostles. And it's those quotations of the apostles that motivate me to do the work I'm doing, because I have found those quotations in the Hebrew text. We'll try to read some more of this. And I mean, I'm not going to read the entirety of all of Jerome's biblical prefaces, but we'll get an idea of what this particular preface is, and then what he did in his other prefaces, and talk, just a little bit more broadly as well about the origins of the Latin Bible and the reception of it.
All right. Well, we will continue on, forge forward next week. We hope that you'll be with us. You can email us at scholars@thelightnetwork.tv. We've had a lot of correspondence and always enjoy that process, and knowing what you're thinking and thoughts that are on your mind and questions that you may have. We're also available on YouTube, the video format, of course, and then audio version everywhere you receive podcasts. You can find this particular show along with all the shows at the Light Network. You can find us at thelightnetwork.tv. We're grateful that you were with us this week, and we hope that you'll join us next week as we go back inside the Scholar's Study.